Dear friends, as part of Topchubashov Center's series of video interviews dedicated to the Karabakh conflict, we are having an interesting guest today, Arman Grigoryan, Associate Professor at the Lehigh University, Pennsylvania, the United States. We are going to cover several interesting topics: the Karabakh conflict, the Armenian diaspora, the Armenian-Azerbaijani, and the Armenian-Turkish relations. Professor Grigoryan, thank you very much for being our guest today. We have
glad to be with you.
Thank you very much. We have interesting topics to discuss today, but let us start with the recent war in Karabakh, given the fresh wounds and hot emotions. It would be very interesting to learn the understanding of a representative of Armenian intelligentsia, how the background, the year zero, if there is any, and triggering factors of the conflict are seen and analyzed by your side.
You mean the triggering factors for the recent escalation, for the Second Karabakh War? Well, I don't know if I think about it in terms of triggering factors. There was the conflict, the conflict has been in place since 1988. There was a war in the early 90s. It ended in a ceasefire, but no political solution. A couple of times the parties came close to a solution, but those efforts failed. And the fact that it was an unresolved conflict clearly meant that at any point there could be escalation. And both in Armenia and in Azerbaijan and elsewhere, many people had been warning about that. And certainly there were people in Armenia who thought that Azerbaijan would be deterred from escalating the conflict. But they were, and perhaps they were the majority in terms of the public opinion and the kind of expert opinion. However, there were people in Armenia as well who warned that this conflict, this status quo, could not be sustained indefinitely, and at some point the conflict would escalate. Now, why the conflict escalated exactly when it did is an interesting question, and it's a question that requires careful analysis and careful study. There were probably many factors, but what I would focus on is as the main factor was the revolution in Armenia 2.5 years ago, and the dramatic changes it introduced in Armenian politics ever since. Now, one of the most important factors connected to the conflict in Karabakh was the fact that Nikol Pashinyan argued, with some justification, of course, that he had not been elected by the people of Karabakh, and we should return to a format that existed in the early 90s with regard to the negotiations where Karabakh represented itself, when Karabakh was considered a party to the conflict. So he argued that he could not negotiate on behalf of Karabakh. Now, a lot of people have argued that that was not really the reason, it was more of a justification. And there are probably some justifications to those criticisms because Pashinyan not only argued that he could not negotiate on behalf of Karabakh and that the negotiating format needs to change, but he also assumed a position that seemed pretty hard line by any standard. And in effect, it meant the ceasing of negotiations. I mean, there was a specific format. Negotiations were happening, and after the revolution in Armenia, in effect, the negotiations ended and the negotiating process was derailed. Now, if you think about it purely in mathematical terms, I mean, if negotiations end, what are the other options? I mean, the other options were Azerbaijan either essentially accepting the status quo or escalating the conflict, and an escalation is what happened. So I think the the revolution, which by necessity introduced this new problem into the negotiating format and the bargaining stance of Armenia, probably was a contributing factor to the escalation. I mean, one other thing, I don't want to speak too long about this, but one other thing which is quite interesting, and I'm working on an article that deals with this problem, is the quite unjustified optimism of the Armenian side about what would happen if escalation took place. Clearly, the Armenian side miscalculated the distribution of power and the international reaction to the escalation. And that miscalculation is something that also needs to be studied carefully, because it's a very shocking miscalculation. It was not so difficult to calculate what would happen in case of escalation, yet that miscalculation did happen on the Armenian side.
Professor, would you like to speak a little bit about the conflict background, because your analysis would be quite interesting?
Well, this is in many ways a very typical conflict. I think both Armenians and Azerbaijanis like to think of this conflict as unique, of their hostility as a unique one, as an unprecedented one in history. On both sides, you have people who attribute the conflict to the other side's unique perspectives and unique evilness. But if you look at it from the perspective of a social scientist, and in comparative terms, this is a conflict that is not different from the ones that took place in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe in general, in Europe at large, throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century. The basic principle of modern international relations, if you will, is the legitimacy of the nation state. And empires or city-states ceased to exist in the 18th, 19th centuries, and the legitimate unit of international politics became the nation state. But with that, with the advent of modern nationalism, came also the idea, this is something that Ernest Gellner defines in his famous book, Nations and Nationalism, that nations and states' borders should be congruent. Now, this gets operationalized in two different ways. I mean, if you're, and we can speak about it in terms of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. For Armenians, the congruence of the nations and states' borders means Karabakh or Armenians outside of Armenia, especially if we're talking about a compact population of Armenians, they should be included in the Armenian state. For Azerbaijan, congruence of nations and borders means, well, it's, Armenians should at best aspire to the role of minority. If they don't like it, they can get the hell out. And this is, in many ways, seems like a zero-sum interaction. And even if it's not zero-sum in principle, it has led to many a conflict. And the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict is not, in principle, very different from that. Even if we can find some specific elements, some unique elements to it, the basic problem is that principle of nationalism and the violation of that principle that existed in the Armenian-Azerbaijani case, and how the two parties interpret it differently. Now, in this context, I would like to add something else. I mean, if you look at a lot of the scholarly literature or a lot of the journalistic accounts of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict in the West, there are all these popular, salacious theories about ancient hatreds and religious conflict and kind of just basic antagonism that Armenians and Azerbaijanis have or have had for a long time as part of their nationalist narrative. So it's not the principle of nationalism according to these studies and these accounts, but it is the content of Armenian and Azerbaijani nationalism that explains it. I firmly reject these ideas. I I have disputed them in print and in many conferences on many occasions. I think Armenians and Azerbaijanis, whatever antagonism exists between Armenians and Azerbaijanis is a consequence of the conflict rather than its cause. And the cause, as I said, is the basic disagreement about the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. And had that conflict been resolved, had we had the wisdom to resolve that conflict politically, Armenians and Azerbaijanis are probably, you know, they would get along just fine. And many Armenians and Azerbaijanis even got along just fine during the First Karabakh War. I always like to tell my American colleagues and friends that one of the most interesting places in the world was the Sadakhlo market on the Armenian-Georgian border, which has an Azerbaijani population, where during the war, there was brisk trade and friendships and interactions between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. So anyway, I don't want to take up too much of your time. But the bottom line for me is that whatever antagonism exists between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, and it's undeniable, is the consequence of the conflict rather than its cause.
Professor Grigoryan, some in Azerbaijan, perhaps in Turkey as well, usually put on the Armenian diaspora a bigger part of the blame on the current situation, which has left Armenia landlocked and surrounded by hostile nations, by referring to the toxic and destructive narratives of the diaspora. In other words, there are people in Azerbaijan who think that keeping Armenia captive for the past traumas and preventing the normalization of Armenia's relations with both Azerbaijan and Turkey, the diaspora has been playing a rather harmful role. How would you assess the role of the overseas Armenians in the conflict, Karabakh conflict? How effective was the Armenian diaspora during the war? And are there any political forces in Armenia right now willing to pursue politics based purely on the capacities and limitations of the actual Armenian state?
Well, my short answer to your question is that in Azerbaijan and in Turkey, the role of the Armenian diaspora is often exaggerated and sometimes exaggerated massively. And the way to assess that exaggeration and to think through it for yourselves would be to ask whether the problem and the conflict would be fundamentally different had there been no diaspora and no diasporan influence. And I'm not sure the answer is yes. I don't think the diaspora bears responsibility for the conflict, and I don't think the conflict would not have happened had Armenians not had the diaspora that they had. Having said that, I think in this case as well, there is nothing unique to the Armenian case and the Armenian diaspora. There is a fundamental structural problem. People in the diaspora do not sometimes can afford the luxury of basing their political attitudes on their emotions, on certain narratives, on history, etc. Armenians in Armenia have to be more pragmatic. And again, this is not a criticism of the diaspora. It's a structural problem, as I said, and it's not unique to Armenians. I mean, there are all sorts of interesting disputes along similar lines with regard to Israel and the Jewish diaspora, and the fact that some groups in the Jewish diaspora are much more radical than the Israeli right. So again, it's nothing unique to the Armenian case. However, yes, there is this structural problem, and it is also true that the diaspora has supported the more hardline elements in Armenia, and probably this has made things somewhat more difficult. But the bottom line is that I think we wouldn't have a fundamentally different situation without the diaspora. What also gets exaggerated in Azerbaijan is the extent to which diaspora participates in Armenian politics, the extent to which diaspora subsidizes Armenia, helps financially. I remember I was talking to an Azerbaijani once at a conference, and I asked him, how much does he think the Armenian diaspora contributes annually to Armenia? And he said something like $2 to $3 billion. And anyway, I had to disillusion him about that number. And again, I think that influence exists. Sometimes it has contributed to the more hardline positions that Armenia has held, or certain political forces in Armenia have held. But attributing the conflict to the diaspora is probably a mistake.
Thank you. In your Washington Post article published a few years ago, you ask an interesting question. The Armenians must decide what they want from Turkey. Recognition of the 1915 events as genocide or territorial restitution. Mm-hmm. Do you have your own answer to it? And let me add a similar question to this one and ask what the Armenians want from Azerbaijan, in your opinion.
Okay, these are two very different questions and very different aspirations or expectations. Let's talk about Turkey first, and the claim I made in that op-ed in the Washington Post. I think, first of all, just looking at it from a purely pragmatic perspective, leaving aside all the moral and normative elements of these conflicting narratives. Demanding territorial restitution is just a pipe dream. I mean, it is not going to happen. Everybody knows it's not going to happen. Some people just pretend that it might. Even if it were to happen, I recently published, it wasn't an article, it was an interview with me about the myths and certain myths that would not die in Armenian political discourse. And one of the things I talked about was a counterfactual that I suggested to Armenians who are holding on to the dream of restoring Armenian sovereignty over historic Armenia. What would happen if Turkey ceded the territories determined by the severed treaty to Armenia? I mean, the one thing that would happen is Armenia would have a very large Kurdish and Turkish population, probably around 15 to 20 million. And there is no answer to that question as to what would happen to the Republic of Armenia with a 20 million Kurdish and Turkish population. And nobody talks about this. And because again, I suspect that a lot of people are not serious when they're talking about territorial restitution and territorial designs. Now, I think it is very important for Turkey to come to terms with the Armenian genocide and to make amends and to signal to Armenians that Turkey knows, understands, and accepts that what happened in 1915 was a horrific crime, and that I don't want to say the modern Turkish society, but the Ottoman Empire bears responsibility for it, and the Turkish Republic, that is the inheritor of the Ottoman legacy, bears some kind of responsibility for it as well. I'm more interested in that kind of a moral restitution and understanding and acceptance in the Turkish society, a kind of approach to it in Turkish history books and textbooks for Turkish schools, that what happened was a crime against a portion of the Ottoman population, essentially, the Ottoman subjects, or at the time they were already citizens. It was not. It was a republic already. The point I tried to make in that article was, in fact, if we talk about genocide recognition as a first step to other aspirations, on the way to fulfilling other aspirations, we're minimizing the chances of the Turkish Republic accepting responsibility for the genocide and making amends for it. And for me, in terms of the security of the state of Armenia and the relations of Armenia with its neighbor, it is far more important that understanding and that approach to Armenian-Turkish relations and to the Turkish history in Turkey than any talk of territorial restitution, which, as I said in the first place, is just a pipe dream, and it's not. I mean, I don't think one can seriously talk about pursuing a policy by the Republic of Armenia that makes the territorial restitution a serious goal. As far as Azerbaijan is concerned, with Azerbaijan, in fact, the situation is much more complicated. It is not just history we're debating with Azerbaijan. It is not primarily history we're debating with Azerbaijan. It is the fate of Karabakh and Karabakh Armenians. And Armenians have legitimate fears about the future of Karabakh Armenians, and especially now that they have been defeated in war, and the defense of Karabakh Armenians, the future of Armenian presence in Karabakh, is somewhat more threatened than it has been in the past. And the point here is not merely, again, the old narratives that Azerbaijan means no good toward Armenians, and that there is something specific in the Azerbaijani attitudes or in the Azerbaijani narratives. It is also a structural problem. We have had this conflict. Now Armenia has lost the war, and naturally there is a sense of vulnerability regarding Karabakh Armenians. And no matter what Azerbaijan does, in fact, there is always going to be this fear, and Azerbaijan is going to have, using social scientific language, a commitment problem, a way of tying its own hands against mistreating Karabakh Armenians, even if it doesn't have any such desires, or even if it doesn't have any such desires today. So it's a rational fear on the part of Armenians, independent of whatever they think about Azerbaijani intentions and Azerbaijani narratives. Now, is this fear something that cannot be ameliorated or addressed? I think it can be. I think there are certain things that Azerbaijan can do to ameliorate these fears. Azerbaijan can afford to do these things now that it has come out victorious in this war. And in general, I think if we're talking about this, it is also related to the future of Armenian-Azerbaijani relations in general, not just the Karabakh conflict. There are two paths Azerbaijan can pursue. One is an attitude and a policy of extracting maximum benefit from this victory, and taking everything they can while it is possible, while Armenia is weak and defeated and so vulnerable. And I mean, obviously there are temptations to do that, and any country in Azerbaijan's position would have such temptations. However, I think it would be wise for Azerbaijan to resist these temptations. And if you look at history, the wiser statesmen and the wiser states have often resisted such temptations. I mean, my favorite strategist in history is Otto von Bismarck, who dealt with victories much more differently, or who dealt with victories differently than many others. Let's put it that way. And Azerbaijan can think that well, Armenia is now prostrate and it's defeated, and there is nothing that Armenia can do, and maximum benefit can be extracted from this situation. But nothing is forever in politics. I mean, Armenians are not going to go anywhere, and Armenia is weak today, and nobody knows what will happen tomorrow. Nobody knows what support Armenia can rely on tomorrow, even if there isn't anything on the horizon at this point. But counting on the fact that Armenia will always be in this position, and there will be absolutely no possibility for Armenia to pursue a revanchist policy, is probably not the wisest thing to do. If Azerbaijan were to pursue the policy of extracting the maximum and not making any concessions to Armenians, I know there are negotiations happening today in Moscow, and there will be more negotiations in the future. So how we resolve this is going to have fundamental consequences, very important consequences for how the Armenian side is going to see its future. Now, there will always be an internal debate in Armenia, and there will always be people that are going to be dissatisfied with the status quo and be in favor of revisionist policies. The point is, the question is, which side Azerbaijan's policy is going to I don't want to say help, but which side is going to be strengthened in Armenian politics, given what strategy Azerbaijan pursues. Now, I think there is a possibility of resolving the conflict, and there is a possibility of having a fairly stable resolution. But for that, Azerbaijan has to think not in terms of exploiting Armenia's weakness today, but creating conditions for a more stable relationship, and not humiliating Armenia, not humiliating Armenian leaders, and creating positive incentives for Armenia as well, for building a more stable and cooperative relationship in this neighborhood. Because we're not going to Mars. Azerbaijanis are not going to Mars. We have to live in this region, and we have to find a way. And both sides, and Azerbaijan has more to do in this regard, because they have been the victorious side in this war, and there are many things that Azerbaijan can do to make that process easier, more than Armenia.
Can we touch upon the Armenian irredentist narrative? Many in Azerbaijan consider the major factor that triggered the Karabakh conflict, and still find a dangerous phenomenon.
Actually, it's good. It gives me an opportunity to speak about something else regarding the Armenian narratives, various nationalist narratives in Armenia over the years, as well as challenges to them. I mean, this is one thing that I think was not properly understood and appreciated either in Turkey or in Azerbaijan. And I'm talking about the fundamental changes that happened in the late 80s and early 90s in the Armenian political discourse. Now, for a very long time, Armenian nationalism has had the narrative of being surrounded by enemies, being surrounded by, at the time, the religious argument has been present as well. And I'm talking about 17th, 18th centuries, and the kind of the early early period of the birth of Armenian nationalism, and how these early Armenian nationalists saw Russia or Christian empires as rescuers of Armenia. And this sort of attitude kind of gelled in Armenian politics or political discourse, that Armenia is surrounded by enemies, and its path to salvation is hitching to the wagon of some Christian empire, and eventually it became Russia mainly. And I'm not inclined to blame things on Russia, or, I mean, Russia has behaved as any other empire in that situation. Russians had the strategy of southward expansion for quite some time, which this particular Armenian nationalism was allied with. Now, later during the Soviet period, the Armenian nationalism, or this particular narrative of Armenian nationalism, was tolerated, if not encouraged, by the Soviet state, because if Armenians thought of Turks as well as Azerbaijanis as their primary threats and adversaries, then any thought of Armenian separatist nationalism, any thought of Armenian independence was going to be retarded. Right. So, and there are interesting documents and interesting studies about this, as to how the very anti-nationalist Soviet Union tolerated Armenian nationalism because of its content and because of what it meant for the Soviet policy and Soviet strategy. Now, in the late 80s, there was an interesting transformation that happened in Armenia, which kind of went unnoticed by most people. And I'm talking even about people who have been studying Armenia and following Armenia. And that transformation was that actually Armenia's main problem is that it's not an independent state. And Armenians should have the normal aspiration of becoming a nation state. And if that were to happen, clearly there would be the problem of dealing with our neighbors. And there were calls of revising the traditional Armenian narrative. And there was an article that was published in 1989 by Rafael Ishkhanyan, who argued that Armenia should fundamentally transform its attitude and, first of all, accept the status quo, not pursue irredentist aspirations, and secondly, not be a part of some great powers, strategy vis-a-vis Armenia's neighbors, and just basically accept the status quo and get along with the neighbors. Now, I'm maybe simplifying Ishkhanyan's article a little bit, but that was essentially the message. And this message, in fact, became the official doctrine of the Armenian national movement in the late 80s and early 90s. I mean, this is something that is not appreciated. And both in Azerbaijan and in Turkey, especially in Azerbaijan, people think that the attitudes toward Karabakh were undifferentiated. The attitudes toward Armenia, toward Azerbaijan were undifferentiated. Within Armenia, they don't see any difference between, let's say, the Dashnaks and the ANM government. But this was a very, very serious difference in Armenia. And this difference did not produce the necessary fruit in terms of normalizing the relations, because at the time, the parties failed to settle the Karabakh conflict peacefully or to prevent its escalation, even though there were attempts. And I should tell you in this regard that Azerbaijan at the time made exactly the same mistake as Armenia made in 2020, which was completely overestimating its capabilities and thinking that it was going to be an easy victory over Armenia, which did not happen, but which at the same time prevented Azerbaijan from making certain concessions to settle the conflict peacefully, which I think was possible at the time. So the bottom line is that there is this sort of internal political conversation in Armenia, and over time, given the political environment and given the political situation and what has happened in the relations with Azerbaijan, in the relations with Russia, in the relations with Turkey, the various parts of these conflicting narratives have become strengthened or weakened. And I think currently there are seeds of a conversation that is beginning to happen in Armenia, which again is questioning Armenia's role in the region, Armenia's role as an ally of some great power, and Armenia's relations with its neighbors, and including with Azerbaijan. I think it's an interesting conversation. And as I said in response to your other question, a lot will depend on how Azerbaijan behaves as to what happens to this internal conversation in Armenia.
Thank you very much, Professor Grigoryan, for sharing your interesting thoughts on various issues concerning not only Armenia, but also Azerbaijan. Therefore, I really hope this interview will catch the interest in not only in both societies, Armenia, Azerbaijan, but also of general audience. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much.